If I told you the score of game was like 473 to 1, you wouldn't just assume one team was having a bad day.
No. I mean, you'd assume they were playing entirely different sports at that point.
Right. But when you see a ratio like that in the realm of global finance, it's not simply a market fluctuation. It is, well, the definition of a network state. Yeah.
Once a gap becomes that wide, the underlying architecture of the world has already chosen a winner, and the rest of the players are, just waiting for the clock to run out.
And that staggering 473 to 1 ratio is the exact reason we are taking this deep dive today. So welcome. We are so glad you're here with us.
Definitely.
Our mission today is to explore this fierce global race for stablecoin dominance, specifically focusing on Europe's increasingly precarious, maybe even impossible position in that race.
Yeah, it's a tough spot.
And to do this, we are putting two incredibly detailed sources on the table today. First, we have an official, very carefully worded speech delivered by the European Central Bank President, Christine Lagarde.
Right, from May 8th, 2026 in Madrid.
Exactly. And second, we have this sharp, completely unsparing analytical piece by an author known as Janus the Watcher, which is titled Lagarde's Cut: Why Europe Cannot Win the Stablecoin Race.
Reading those two texts together presents this fascinating contradiction. On one hand, you have the highly polished institutional view from the very top of the European monetary system.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have a complete structural teardown of that exact view, exposing the mechanical flaws in the central bank's strategy.
Now, you might be sitting there thinking, stablecoins, isn't that just a niche tech experiment for crypto traders? Like, why does this affect me?
Right. A lot of people think that.
But here's why you should care. These digital tokens are rapidly becoming the invisible plumbing of the entire global financial empire.
Yeah, they dictate how money moves, how cross-border trade is settled, and, ultimately where economic power is concentrated.
Exactly. So understanding who controls this plumbing is essentially a shortcut to understanding the future of national sovereignty. Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly did Christine Lagarde say on that stage in Madrid that caused such a massive stir?
What's fascinating here is that she essentially said the quiet part out loud. I mean, central bankers are traditionally expected to defend their currency's digital potential to the bitter end, right? But Lagarde stated plainly that private stablecoins are not an efficient way to strengthen the international role of the euro.
Which is, that's a massive concession for the president of a central bank to make. She's effectively waving a white flag on the private digital token front.
She is. And she justified it by citing severe financial stability risks. She compared stablecoins to money market funds.
Okay.
And she pointed directly back to the 2023 Silicon Valley Bank collapse to illustrate her fear.
Oh, wow. Yeah. SVB.
And if we remember how that played out, SVB suffered a classic bank run, which forced them to sell off their underlying government bonds at a massive loss.
Because the company behind USDC, which is, one of the world's biggest dollar stablecoins, they had billions in cash reserves stuck inside that failing bank.
So that's why USDC temporarily lost its one-to-one peg with the dollar.
Precisely.
I remember that. The panic was absolute. People were watching a supposedly stable digital dollar drop in value in real time, all because the traditional bank holding its collateral was collapsing.
Exactly. That is the exact nightmare scenario Lagarde was highlighting. She warned that if there were a rapid systemic shift from traditional bank deposits into private stablecoins, it could cripple traditional bank lending.
Because all the capital drains out of the banks.
Right. Furthermore, she argued it would fundamentally weaken the European Central Bank's ability to transmit its monetary policy to the broader economy.
Because if people are storing their wealth in private tokens rather than bank accounts, the ECB loses its leverage over interest rates and credit creation.
You hit the nail on the head. This is where the analytical piece by Janus the Watcher comes in with this concept of Lagarde's cut. He suggests there's a deeper layer to her speech that most of the audience missed. Let's break that down.
So Lagarde's cut is an observation that Lagarde effectively separated the stablecoin as an instrument from its actual function.
Okay, instrument versus function.
Right. The instrument is just the digital token itself. It's a piece of code. It's relatively easy to issue. But the function is the underlying architecture of global settlement, the actual rails that the token rides on. So Lagarde is essentially telling the room, we don't need the instrument. But the author argues she couldn't take the next logical step and talk about the architecture.
Why not?
Because formally endorsing a specific decentralized global settlement layer vastly exceeds her mandate as the ECB president. She can't just tell Europe to use a decentralized network.
Ah, so she left the force mate on the board hoping the room would see it, but they didn't.
Exactly. They interpreted her remarks as just a simple defense of the traditional euro.
And to understand why that interpretation is so backwards, we really have to look at the raw data Janus pulls into his analysis. The data distilled by Nick Puckrin from Diffalama.
Yeah, the numbers are just staggering.
On the morning of that speech, the dollar stablecoin market cap was 473 times larger than the euro stablecoin market cap. Think about that scale.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
Right. Over 99.5% of all stablecoin float in circulation globally is denominated in US dollars. Every other fiat peg combined, the euro, the yen, the British pound, all of them, makes up less than half of 1% of the market.
That is the gravitational pull we're dealing with here. It is an overwhelming monopoly on digital liquidity.
Yeah, so if I'm playing a game where the score is 473 to 1, I don't just need a new strategy on the field. I need an entirely new game. But the European institutional instinct right now seems to be relying really heavily on legislation. For anyone not living and breathing European policy, the EU recently rolled out a massive regulatory framework known as MiCA.
Right, which acts as their comprehensive rulebook for crypto assets.
Yeah. And the assumption seems to be that if Europe regulates the space heavily enough, they can simply mandate a safe environment for a euro stablecoin to flourish. So can regulation by decree actually overcome that 473 to 1 gap?
Well, if we connect this to the fundamental mechanics of how digital assets work, the answer is a hard no. Gravity doesn't move just because a regulator passes a law telling it to. Regulators can build a highly secure, beautifully compliant wall around their domestic market. They can dictate what exchanges European citizens are allowed to use, but they have absolutely zero power to dictate what the rest of the world uses to settle cross-border trade.
But institutional momentum usually defaults to fighting fire with fire, right? Like, the obvious reflex for Europe would be to build a massive, heavily regulated domestic stablecoin to fight back against the dollar's dominance. Why does the source material argue that this instinct is actually a lethal trap?
The analysis outlines 3 structural realities that shatter the dream of a dominant euro stablecoin. The first is just the simple mechanism of liquidity asymmetry. Stablecoins are essentially network goods. Their utility is entirely dependent on how many people use them, how many trading pairs quote them, and, how deep the liquidity pools are.
So it is the classic network effect. Like, a telephone is a brilliant piece of technology, but it is completely useless if you are the only person on Earth who owns one.
That is the perfect analogy. A brilliantly designed euro stablecoin might function perfectly fine for transactions inside the borders of Europe. But the moment that value needs to cross a border, say, a German manufacturer needs to pay a supplier in Brazil, or a French company needs to settle a trade in Asia, it hits a wall.
Because the rest of the world isn't using it.
Exactly. The global liquidity pools, the venues that facilitate those trades, they operate almost exclusively in dollars. So an internally focused euro stablecoin isn't a global settlement tool at all. The author dismissively refers to it as nothing more than a digital account with a token wrapper.
A glorified checking account with a token wrapper, that strips away the technological mystique pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But even if Europe managed to somehow solve that liquidity issue and get people using the token, they walk right into a much more dangerous macroeconomic trap, don't they?
They do. And this is the second structural reality, the forced buyer trap. To understand this, we have to look at how the United States weaponized their own stablecoin market through legislation like the Genius Act.
Yeah.
That framework essentially turned dollar stablecoin issuers into captive systemic buyers of U.S. Treasury bills.
Let me make sure I'm mapping the mechanics of that correctly. If a company issues $1 billion digital dollars, they take in $1 billion actual dollars from users.
Right.
And under this framework, they're required to take that cash and buy U.S. government debt to back the tokens, which means the stablecoin market is actively funding the American government.
That is exactly how it works. And it's a phenomenal system for the United States. But imagine the European equivalent.
Okay.
If Europe mandates that a euro stablecoin must be backed by European sovereign debt, the issuer is forced to buy massive quantities of German bunds, French OATs, Italian BTPs. This structurally forces the European Central Bank to become a systemic buyer and guarantor of that debt just to maintain the peg stability.
Let me jump in here because the mechanics of why that is so dangerous are fascinating. I mean, central banks buy debt all the time, but The trap triggers when the economic weather changes, right?
Exactly.
Imagine inflation spikes. The standard playbook for a central bank fighting inflation is to raise interest rates to cool the economy down. But in the bond market, interest rates and bond prices operate on an inverse seesaw. When interest rates go up, the value of older bonds that were issued at lower rates completely crashes.
And that is the exact mechanism that triggers the insolvency crisis.
Wow.
Yeah, if the ECB raises interest rates to fight inflation, the value of the European bonds, acting as the reserves for their digital euro, plummets.
So suddenly your stablecoin is backed by assets that are worth less than the tokens in circulation.
Precisely. The central bank becomes trapped. They cannot aggressively fight inflation without intentionally crashing the collateral that supports their own digital currency. It is, as the text describes it, a macroeconomic suicide pill.
A suicide pill?
Yeah, they would be trading their actual monetary flexibility for the mere aesthetic of having a digital token.
Which brings us to the third structural reality outlined in the piece, which Janus calls the broken ruler. This explores the idea that the fiat unit of account itself, like the actual yardstick we use to measure value, is drifting.
Right.
To explain this, the author points to the Buffett indicator. For context, the Buffett indicator is a relatively straightforward metric. You take the total market capitalization of all publicly traded stocks and divide it by the gross domestic product, the GDP, of the country. Historically, a ratio over 100% means the market is overvalued. But the text cites this indicator sitting at an astonishing 230%.
Yeah, the 230% figure is a glaring warning sign. It demonstrates that the liquidity being pumped into the system by central banks is vastly outpacing actual, real-world economic output, lagging demographics, and sluggish productivity.
So the money supply is expanding way faster than the creation of real value.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we synthesize that, building a digital token to the euro is basically just putting a bending ruler on high-speed rails. You can measure and transfer things much faster using blockchain technology, but the measurements themselves are still fundamentally warped.
That's a great way to look at it.
So if a private euro stablecoin is a macroeconomic suicide pill and the fiat unit of account is a bending ruler, what is the ECB actually doing to solve this?
Well, Lagarde's actual proposed solutions lean heavily into building deeply integrated internal infrastructure.
Okay.
Her speech outlined goals for deeper capital market integration across Europe, the expansion of tokenized bank deposits, and the eventual rollout of a central bank digital Euro 1, strictly anchored in central bank money rather than private debt, potentially arriving by 2029.
2029. I mean, in the world of digital finance, 2029 is a geological era away. Entire ecosystems are born and die in 3 years.
It is incredibly slow, yes.
Yeah.
But she also heavily promoted the Eurosystem's internal plumbing projects. Specifically, she pointed to the Appia roadmap, which is their vision for an interoperable digital ecosystem by 2028.
All right.
And something called the Pontis project. Pontis is scheduled to launch in the third quarter of 2026, and its goal is to facilitate wholesale distributed ledger technology settlement.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here, or at least play devil's advocate for a second. Pontis literally translates to bridges.
True.
Building a secure, sovereign internal network seems like a highly logical first step. Isn't building a walled garden exactly how you protect a fledgling domestic system from being overwhelmed by foreign capital? Why is it inherently a bad idea for Europe to prioritize its own internal safety first?
Because of the nature of global trade. The author contrasts Europe's vision of internal plumbing with this brilliant historical analogy, the Roman aqueduct. Yeah, the Roman aqueducts were infrastructural marvels, because they were shared systems. They moved a vital resource, water, across vast, fiercely competitive, politically distinct territories.
Right.
But crucially, they were not fully owned or monopolized by any single local actor along the route. They functioned because they were a neutral layer that everyone relied upon.
So you're saying Pontis, despite its name, isn't actually a bridge to the outside world?
No, Pontis is just internal piping. It connects the target-side wholesale banking apparatus inside Europe with the new DLT wholesale apparatus, which is also inside Europe. It is essentially a hallway connecting the European kitchen to the European living room. But think about the mechanics of actual global commerce. Imagine a French importer trying to pay a Brazilian exporter. That transaction cannot occur purely within European internal plumbing.
No, of course not.
They need an outside layer. When you need an aqueduct that crosses sovereign territories, not a closed-loop pipe.
So what does this all mean for Europe's strategy? We are building brilliant walled gardens while the rest of the world is laying down global pipes. It sounds like Europe is obsessing over upgrading the gold-plated plumbing in the guest bathroom while the entire house is actively being disconnected from the city water main.
That is exactly what's happening.
Which transitions perfectly into what Janus calls the illusions of Brussels. These are the blind spots in European policy. Let's weave through those, starting with the regulation we defined earlier, MiCA.
Right, so the primary illusion is the belief that a regulatory framework like MiCA acts as a protective moat for global liquidity. Policymakers often assume that by setting the rules, they control the game.
Sure, that's the classic regulatory mindset.
Exactly. But MiCA only governs the domestic surface. A European citizen might be forced to use a highly regulated compliant exchange to buy tokens, but the actual deep currents of global value, the massive cross-border trade flows, decentralized finance lending protocols, the savings of citizens in emerging markets, all of that happens entirely outside of European supervision.
So regulation does not dictate global adoption.
No, it doesn't.
And that leads directly to the second illusion, which is the idea that plurality equals sovereignty. The political thought process seems to be, well, as long as we offer a digital euro as an option alongside the digital dollar, we have maintained our sovereignty.
Which is a fundamental misunderstanding of network effects. If a government spends billions launching a digital token, but the global market unanimously decides to continue settling trades using dollar stablecoins, well, that unused digital euro is nothing more than a consolation prize sitting on a shelf.
Right. Offering an option is totally meaningless if there is no organic adoption.
Exactly.
The third illusion feels like the most philosophical, but perhaps the most consequential. It's the belief that a truly neutral layer in finance is a fiction. Regulators inherently look for the throat to choke. They assume every network, somewhere, is ultimately controlled by a corporation or a state entity.
And that is the paradigm that blockchain architecture shatters. Neutrality in this context isn't the absence of jurisdiction or the absence of rules.
Okay, then what is it?
True neutrality is the absence of a single jurisdictional choke point. It means no single government can unilaterally shut down the network or censor a transaction.
So essentially, if Europe needs to connect to the city water main, this neutral settlement layer, we have to look at who is currently occupying that global infrastructure. If the US dollar has already definitively won the race for token issuance, how can Europe or anyone else possibly fight back?
This brings us to the core thesis of the piece, a concept the author calls the Trojan in the architecture.
The Trojan horse.
Exactly. The US dollar has clearly won the issuance war, yes. But the actual battleground has shifted one layer deeper, from the token itself down to the settlement rails those tokens ride on. To illustrate this, the analysis points to a fascinating real-world example, Ripple's RLUSD.
Right, which is a dollar-pegged stablecoin issued by a highly established US-based company.
Correct. You have a highly credible, well-capitalized American issuer. But look at the mechanism of their strategy. They are deliberately pulling massive volumes of dollar liquidity onto a decentralized settlement layer, the XRP ledger, that was not designed to be explicitly American or controlled by the U.S. government.
Wait, really? So are we saying that major players are basically using the dollar's massive dominance to sneak liquidity onto a decentralized layer that America doesn't actually own?
Yes.
That is wild.
It is an incredible architectural paradox. Because whoever wins the issuance race, which is currently the dollar, absolutely cannot be allowed to control the underlying settlement layer.
Why not?
Because if the United States government controls the settlement layer, they have the power to censor transactions, freeze assets, and dictate trade terms anywhere in the world. The network would cease to be global. It would just be an extension of American foreign policy.
Okay, but how does a decentralized system actually prevent that capture? We talked about the absence of a choke point, but how does that work mechanically?
The author points to systems like the Unique Node List, or UNL, utilized by the XRP ledger.
Okay.
Imagine a global voting council that confirms every transaction. To achieve true neutrality, this council must be populated by diverse, independent validators distributed across the globe, universities, tech companies, financial institutions, in completely different jurisdictions.
I see.
So the U.S. government subpoenas every American validator and demands they freeze a specific wallet. The network does not halt. The validators in Switzerland, Japan, Brazil, and elsewhere continue to confirm valid transactions, overriding the localized censorship attempt.
Wow.
Yeah, that diverse validator mechanism is the only part of the technological stack that the dollar's overwhelming network effect cannot simply buy or absorb.
That reframes the entire European mission, then. Europe shouldn't be obsessed with minting a token just to say they have one.
Exactly. Janus calls that petulant token competition. Europe's true mandate shouldn't be fighting a lost war over token issuance. Their mandate must be aggressive integration, adoption, and governance at the validator level of these neutral networks.
So, as the author brilliantly distills it, the currency stays European, but the settlement becomes shared.
It is a profound paradigm shift.
Frick, in the world of financial analysis, a theory is only as good as its ability to be tested. Does the author offer a way to prove this thesis wrong? I mean, what does the testable future look like?
He does, and this is the mark of rigorous analysis. Janus outlines strict falsifiability for his thesis, providing 4 specific, observable events that would break his argument.
Okay, like what?
For instance, he states that if a highly regulated, domestically focused euro stablecoin somehow manages to capture a 5% share of the global market by the fourth quarter of 2027 without relying on artificial government subsidies or mandates to force adoption, then his entire structural premise is wrong.
Because hitting that 5% metric organically would prove that the 473-to-1 liquidity asymmetry can, in fact, be overcome by good regulation and a solid token design.
Precisely. Another testable condition involves the Pontis project we discussed.
The internal plumbing.
Right. If Europe's internal Pontis infrastructure miraculously succeeds in attracting major non-EU stablecoin issuers to route their global settlement flows through European pipes, well, the thesis breaks. The argument is not a prophecy. It is a testable architectural framework.
We have covered a tremendous amount of complex ground today, so let's recap the mechanics of the journey we just took. We started with ECB President Christine Lagarde making the massive concession that private euro stablecoins pose severe systemic risks, essentially saying the quiet part out loud and separating the digital token from the actual settlement architecture.
Right.
Then we explored the crushing reality of that 473-to-1 market cap ratio, proving that the dollar has already won the issuance war. We unpacked the mechanics of the forced buyer trap, demonstrating how backing a digital euro with sovereign debt creates a macroeconomic suicide pill the moment interest rates rise.
Exactly.
And finally, we contrasted Europe's focus on internal Pontis plumbing with the vital necessity of governing the global Roman aqueducts, the neutral, decentralized settlement layers validated by diverse global nodes.
It clearly delineates the difference between desperately chasing the aesthetic of sovereignty and actually doing the hard work to build the architecture of sovereignty.
And for you, listening to this deep dive, why do these architectural decisions matter to your daily life? Because the purchasing power of the money in your pocket, the cost of the goods you buy, and the fundamental economic independence of the region you live in ultimately depend on who governs the invisible pipes beneath the global economy.
It really does all come down to the plumbing.
A nation cannot simply legislate sovereignty into existence. It has to actively build and integrate into the architecture that supports it. Or, at the very absolute minimum, it has to show up and help govern the shared, neutral architecture that is already being constructed by the rest of the world.
Yeah, and if we want to fully understand the ultimate terrifying stakes of getting this architectural transition wrong, I want to leave you with a final thought derived from a detail in one of the author's companion pieces. On April 30th, 2026, the Central Bank of Japan was forced to deploy $35 billion in a single day.
Wait, $35 billion. Burned in 24 hours. Let's contextualize that mechanic.
Right.
They had to sell off their own dollar reserve to buy up their own currency, the yen, just to artificially prop up its value against the overwhelming strength of the US dollar in the open market.
Yeah. They spent $35 billion in one day just to keep their national unit of account, their bending ruler, somewhat straight against the gravity of the dollar in our current traditional system.
That is hard to even fathom.
It is. So if a massive industrialized sovereign nation has to burn capital at that unprecedented scale today, what happens to the economies of those nations when 90% of all global commercial payments eventually run on frictionless, instantly settled dollar stablecoins?
Wow.
Does independent national monetary policy even exist in that future? Or do central banks simply become obsolete, ceremonial administrators of a network they have absolutely no power to control?
That is a chilling question, and it is the absolute perfect place to leave this discussion. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structure of the world around you, and remember, just because you cannot see the plumbing beneath the floorboards doesn't mean it isn't dictating exactly where the power flows.